Visionary. By Douglas Milewski. Elemental P. United States. Copyright 2016 by Douglas Milewski. All rights reserved. Chapter 8. Despite the ideal that we were now an independent country, and that developments in Great Britain would never influence us again, history proved us wrong. Some of us wanted that ideal, but not all of us. Like us, Britain uses a parliamentary system. When there's a vote of no confidence, the people go to the polls. The results of this election astonished everyone. Labour went down in defeat before the Tories, electing Moses Avon as the Prime Minister. The Tories had lost power near the end of the Great War. The public had had their fill of defeat and futility, replacing them with a Labour victory. It was the Labour government under Alistair Bixby who sued for peace, proceeding over the dismantling of the British Empire. It was Labour who signed the Treaty of Paris, agreeing to crushing reparations. It was Labour who turned the great British wizards over to the German tribunals for the crime of Ypres. Later in life I spoke with one of the German negotiators, Berthold van der Graaf. According to him, Germany had desperately wanted the American colonies for their own. Fortunately for us, Berthold and his negotiators had demonstrated level heads. By their estimation, the American colonies would fight back against any invader, just as we had routinely rebelled against the British. The estimated total cost for such an overseas operation was astronomical, with a timeline stretching into decades. Realizing that the German people would not stand another decade of war, the negotiators backed our freedom instead. They would have their hands full with India, Africa, and China, and better that we be a thorn to Britain. So Britain walked silently into that cold night, the sun having finally set on their empire. There the public dreamed again. There Moses Avon dreamed. A wizard who had graduated at the bottom of his class, and reputedly barely passed his finals, Moses Avon had been the only wizard to be judged by the Ypres tribunals to be not guilty. After the war, the man publicly converted to Catholicism, further decreasing any chance of relevance. Yet what he lacked in wizardry, the man made up for with sophistry, rising to guide the Tories for their metaphorical 40 years in the desert, promising them a new Jerusalem. Avon had a single message, that the Treaty of Paris had been illegitimate, and that everything that had followed from that treaty was illegitimate. That spring the man finally delivered. The public voted the Tories into office with Moses Avon as Prime Minister. As their first act, the Tories deposed Queen Louise as too German, replacing her with her son King Edward VIII. Though simple sounding now, the events unfolded over weeks, with the drama making the front pages of every paper. The downfall of the monarchs was our object lesson. This is what the communists had saved us from. In the new order, such chaos was no longer possible. Communists had invented a new kind of permanent chaos, one that made the public hungry for their old object lessons. Moses Avon vowed to drive out the communists and reunite the empire. He sounded strong. He sounded like he could succeed, that the spirit of the Tories would carry them through. We might again be part of the empire. We might again have some rulers who were not the communists, ready to end the political nightmare that we called the Free States of America. With so much drama so close to heart, the communists got nervous. Would there be war? Would the British wizards force us back into the empire? Who could we turn to for protection? We certainly didn't rule the seas. And what of the people? Who would the people back? We could still suffer defeat from behind. Although we call ourselves one nation, our radicals told us that we were many nations living on top of each other, intermixed, impure mongrels in need of purer leadership. If we were not to be subsumed in a degenerate and immoral tide, those of untainted Anglo-Saxon blood must rise up and guarantee their heritage. That didn't matter. Fiat lux chose sides first. On May Day, the traditional celebration day of the communists, Cymbeline and I were celebrating the publication of my third story. We had taken the trolley downtown to see the army parade on Light Street. The communists loved rolling out their increasingly obsolescent military hardware, marching the troops by for all to see. Where before this had just been a show of the people's strength, it now felt like a show of the communist strength, the illusion of stability, as if today their opposition needed to see what they would face if they stood up against the party in power. If that was the message, nobody listened. After the parade, we went to the carnival set up along the waterfront. This was the sort of carnival that toured county fairs in small towns, and once a year came to the big city because communists paid in cash. Many a young man blew his wages on rigged games of no chance among those temples of paint and light. In the evening, just around dark, with no sound and no warning, a brick moving at ballistic speeds hurled horizontally through the carnival, pulverizing its way through the crowd. People screamed. Other people looked around. Following that first brick, a second appeared further up the street. More blood, more screams. Cymbeline wanted to help, but I pulled her back. No, I shouted to her, pulling her, speaking my worst fear. Their range-finding. After a pause, with everyone's attention now peaked, an entire pallet of bricks appeared at ballistic speeds, tumbling down the fairway. I remember screams. After the screams came panic. After the panic came the crush. All now understood in their primitive egos that death prowled nearby. They ran. They stampeded. They murdered each other to escape from murder. When we turned around, we saw a mother sobbing over her son, her blue dress drenched in red as the life ebbed from him. No last words, no goodbyes. Her crimson hands held onto him like Mary must have held onto Jesus. Her wail came from the same place. Do you remember what I said about teleportation? Do you remember how dangerous it was? I had never thought to turn that technique's side effects into a weapon. Such an idea had never been useful before for good reason. A field gun can do the same thing more cheaply and more reliably. I suppose that weaponizing teleportation had never happened because dropping high-speed projectiles into unsuspecting crowds was unthinkable and served no military purpose. But once you have people who don't have cannons and don't want to be caught, and see everyone who isn't their ally as their enemy, then teleportation with no controls made an excellent weapon. Fiat Lux made their intentions clear, having sent a sheaf of leaflets along with their attack. The radio never read the demands because the censors suppressed that, but I saved a copy. We, the defenders of our motherland and restorers of proper order, give the following demands to the Free States: that the colonies rejoin Britain, submitting themselves to the will of the Crown, that the Communist Party repeal the Constitution, that all wizards be freed from Judas Iscariot prison and repatriated from abroad, that the Catholic Church be legalized and returned to power, and that price controls be implemented on food so that people can eat. If these demands are not met, we will act again. Fiat Lux. Just like that, with words "let there be" and Fiat Lux became real. Before this, they had just been an anarchist group, some wannabes that had amounted to nothing or seemingly nothing. Now I saw that they had actually been more organized than the papers had indicated. We now know that these sorts of incidents had been happening to some degree or another all over the country, but the censors had kept them out of the papers. The communists were quite good at disappearing their opponents through censorship and propaganda. Fiat Lux was merely the latest example of a revolutionary group, albeit one which now demonstrated magical principles. The psychology of such revolutionary groups was always the same: if you rose up, the people would suddenly agree with you and rise up as well. If there had been enough suffering, then Fiat Lux may have been correct in that supposition, but the one saving grace of our homegrown communists was that they had never been dumb enough to touch food production. Their leaders understood the lesson of bread and circuses. Farmers were already slaves to the land, and nobody else wanted to be a slave. I suppose that the announcement by Britain induced Fiat Lux to act. If there was any time to send a serious message to the communists, this was it. I doubt that they had any warning about the change in Britain's government, and my guess is that they had been preparing this attack for May Day anyway, repurposing it into political support at the last moment. One doesn't set up a teleportation system on a whim, even one as brutally simple and direct as the one that they had chosen. The government would see them as a vanguard, as a forward element of the British Empire. From the start, I thought that the government was wrong on that point. Fiat Lux were clearly no vanguard. They were supplicants. They acted with the hope of a bigger friend coming over to help them, showing that now was the best time to act. Would they succeed? They might, but only if they were extraordinarily effective. Getting out of the battleground proved necessary. Cymbeline was already kneeling down, comforting the woman. I pulled her up, fighting her. We have to go. Inspectors. I saw the conflict in the woman's eyes, the first real tenderness that I had ever seen. Her eyes were blue like the sky just then, full of God's grace. She only felt mercy. Leaving proved difficult for all the reasons that I had just explained. I took us behind the stands and through the lot where all the carnival trucks were parked. I had no idea where we were going, and we wouldn't be home for another 2 hours, but we weren't getting interviewed by any inspectors. Once far enough away, we rested on a stoop. Cymbeline drove her face into my neck, finally letting herself feel. I held on as best as I could. I felt no need to cry, but in the coming weeks I would feel no need to sleep. The horrors of that day were not easily forgotten. Once I understood the attack, I ripped paper out of my notebooks and immediately began crude calculations. There were many variables, but my rough numbers showed that the teleportation originated within 40 miles of the city, but at least 15 miles away. That was a huge swath to search, but not impossible. It took me 10 minutes and a slide rule. Any halfwit could have figured this out. The first few bricks coming in were tests. In truth, we don't know how many bricks were launched. The big attack was the last batch of bricks. Just like artillery, these people had spotters. Murder does not begin to describe the crimes of that day. The paper said that 323 people died. I later learned that the real death toll was 57. Somehow that lower number felt even more macabre. One thing was certain, something more was bound to come.